Good morning to everybody, and welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. It always matters for me a lot. Maybe I'm slightly less exhausted today than I normally am, but I'm sure this is true for many of you too, on any morning. At any rate, today we are going to be discussing what I called an ode to accountability. And I will explain what that means momentarily. And I know, and I tried to go back and I didn't have time to go back and fully look at the number of times I've mentioned accountability on History Matters. I know it's a lot. I'm taking a different approach today. So after 2 years, I sort of feel like every once in a while I'm going to inch towards something I've already done, because that's a lot of separate subjects. But I haven't talked about accountability in this way, and it makes sense that I talk about it all the time because it's pretty central, obviously, to democracy and to the moment that we're in. But before I continue to talk about accountability, I will turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will offer the rules of the game.
So good morning, everybody. We're delighted to have everybody back. I'm Annie Evans. I'm the Director of Education at New American History, and delighted to be here with you and Joanne on Fridays to engage in democracy in all shapes and forms with Mugs and Newbie. So we have a great chat, a very robust chat going on nonstop all throughout the talk. But if you want your questions answered, you gotta put them in the Q&A. So please put your questions. You can start as soon as Joanne starts talking. Don't wait till the end. Add your questions in and we will get to them after Joanne talks with us for about a half an hour. So we're excited to learn today. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so I've been talking about accountability for a long time because, as I said in 500 tweets, I'm sure, and in some of the op-eds that I've written, we are in a crisis of accountability on a whole bunch of levels. And obviously this relates to January 6th. And I've spoken a lot about the reasons, first of all, the reasons why the hearings were vital. I've even said, whatever happens with the hearings, even just having them is vital, because it shows that there is some degree of accountability. People are being questioned about what they did. Without hearings, in essence, there would be no accountability for what happened on January 6th. And that would be pretty dire. So even just having the hearings is important in that way. So, in many ways I have, and I'm sure many of you have, been focused on January 6th and accountability and who's being held accountable, and members of the public are being held accountable, not necessarily people higher up on the chain, and that's its own question, and I won't delve into that today, not very much at least. But anyway, so my accountability rants have been largely focused on January 6th, which is not to say that there are not many other ways in which there's no accountability right now in many other venues. I mean, and I'm going to talk about the spectrum of accountability, because part of what I'm going to be talking about today is that word doesn't have one simple meaning, which is interesting, and I think really applies to where we are today. The thing that inspired me to talk about accountability today was the Alex Jones trial, where he has been found, I'm not going to get the actual legal charge, basically guilty of, I don't know what the word is, someone out there, I can't see what you're saying, but at any rate, he was found guilty for what he said about how Sandy Hook was a hoax, how the parents were actors. These really, I can't even give words to the degree, I don't like to use the word evil, but parents who lose a child in that way, and then have to deal with this and the fact that it turned people against these parents who are already grieving on any number of levels. It's beyond. But so, and he, even if I'm getting this correct, I did not delve into this. He didn't show up for the first part of his trial. I think he only came to the second. So he wasn't even being accountable to the judicial process. But at any rate, my response, my emotional response to this moment. And I obviously have not delved into the legal repercussions, and obviously there's all kinds of other ways in which he may very well be held accountable. And, you know, if he's being held accountable to particularly these parents and the legal system by me. But it was I felt such a sense of relief, I guess, to see someone who had been blatantly lying in a way clearly meant to drum up emotion, which I've talked about 100 million times, right? That's what propaganda is, in part, is to fuel people with emotion, and so that they're not thinking necessarily, they're responding emotionally, and that has a real power to it. He's been lying all over the place on his show, getting people fired up with the lies, and doing that for a really long time with seemingly no price, right? And we see that we are in a moment in time when, on many levels, in many ways, it's not as though lying is new in politics. It clearly isn't. I could take you all the way back in time, and we could talk about lies. But what's interesting about the current moment is the blatantness, the almost parading of the ability to lie without repercussions, without accountability. And, you know, sometimes it certainly leaves me sometimes open-mouthed at how obviously wrong and obviously misleading some pieces of information are out there. And you know that, and I know that, and a lot of people looking at whatever is being said know that. And yet there it is being spread around and then re-spread around. And what do you do, right? So part of the crisis of our time is this lying without seemingly any accountability. Now that brings us to the idea of the spectrum, because up until now, the way in which I've been talking about accountability has been, you know, you have to be, people in office, people with political power need to be held accountable while they have power. In a democracy or a democratic form of government, the American people, or whoever the people are, lend power to power holders in ideally free and fair elections, and then have the power to take it back, either in a new election or through other means, right? So it's public servant has a meaning, and accountability is central to that. Accountability is the heart of democracy. But we are in this moment where we don't see a whole lot of it. And it really leads to, well, questions about where our government is going and where it is, and where we're headed next. I've talked about it in that way as being a concrete thing. The rule of law holds accountability in place. So accountability is politicians being responsible to us for what they do. But one of the things I'm going to talk about today is that there's how do I want to put it? There's a malleability, or at least I don't like that word. Let's say there's kind of there's an amorphous nature to some accountability. There's a little squishiness to it. And by that, I don't mean, I can get away with this because X. By that, I mean, accountability is partly the rule of law, partly a democratic political system, and partly it has to do with a sense of responsibility to society at large. You could even say a moral sense of responsibility to society at large. In part, it has to do with commonality. In part, it has to do with mutuality, right? It has to do with all of the things words that we might associate with community. But a democratic system, the demos, is a kind of community. And so part of what I want to talk about today, I do want to talk about accountability and how it was discussed in the founding period. But I also want to make this important point, which is, and it's not necessarily a reassuring point. I was making my notes this morning, and I was thinking to myself, I'm not sure where I'll be when I end. I'm not sure where I'll be when I end. Let's put it that way. I'll leave it with that and we'll see where I land. But at any rate, I think it's an important point because I think part of our current, and I think I said in a tweet, we're swimming in a sea of a crisis of accountability. We're lost in this crisis of accountability. And I really do think we are. I just think, and my saying, having the hearings, regardless of what happens, is really important, is part of this sort of amorphous center of accountability, in that attitude matters, and feelings about what is allowable or what isn't allowable matters. All of these things, these sort of seemingly squishy things, right? These more human things that are still grounded on the rule of law, still grounded on the basic tenets of democracy, but the fact that all of these things, accountability, democracy, also rely fundamentally on the relationship of people to each other, the political system at large, and the people they give power to. That's part of what I want to get at today. Now, it is a particular problem in any kind of democratic form of government. And as I was thinking about this morning, I thought about Alexander Hamilton, surprise. But I thought about the Federalist, in which he's talking about the presidency, and he generally wrote the Federalist essays that were on the presidency. He was very interested in executive power, which is not a surprise, given that he was very interested in increasing the centrality and power of the national government. And there's one essay in particular where he talks about why having a council, an executive council rather than a single executive, makes sense. And I know I've mentioned this at some point in the last 2 years, which I can say a lot these days. But the point here, the relevance to what we're talking about here, is his thought was, if you have an executive council rather than a single individual, members of a council, if there's a wrong committed, if there's something that's done that's illegal or corrupt, members of a council can hide behind each other. They can avoid responsibility. They can basically just sort of allow corruption to swim beneath them, and there will be no accountability because it'll be easy to sort of fudge that. So what Hamilton says in this Federalist essay is, if we have a single executive, that person will be partly held in check by the fact that he, and at this point it would have been he, will be responsible, personally responsible for his actions. So that if he does something corrupt, if he does something bad, he does it knowing that he will be obviously responsible for it. And so shame and personal responsibility and upholding your reputation, all of those things will help keep executives, now presidents, in line. Now, thinking about that this morning, one of the things that I thought was, it's fascinating when I sort of dig into that a little. Alexander Hamilton was someone who pretty fundamentally didn't have a lot of faith in human nature. And when you read through his writings, one thing he says in a variety of different ways, again and again and again, is you need to put a system in motion, a political system in motion, that can channel human passions and emotions. You need to find a way to channel all of the ways in which human beings are going to behave badly, because they will, because that's what we do, because we're human. So he really fundamentally saw government as a way to steer passions, and he didn't rely or assume that the public would go the right way. Thomas Jefferson had a very different view. But given that view, that Hamilton really didn't rely on human nature, it's kind of interesting that he basically says a president will worry about his reputation and will worry about shame, and that will hold him back. Now, Hamilton, that would be true, right? He was very worried about public reputation, and that would have been true for many elite in this period. But on a fundamental level, it's interesting that that's what he had faith in, that dynamic would work, and not a lot of faith in other things. And I think partly that has to do with having more faith in the elite behaving a certain way than the American public behaving a certain way. But still, that's an interesting mode of accountability that is kind of Hamiltonian, but kind of shows, again, maybe an sort of aristocratic leaning to the way he's thinking about democratic governance. The problem and the power of accountability, as it was understood in early America, is that on the one hand, people running for office, they didn't really campaign, but certainly people who were put up for office, which is the wonderful passive way in which that was described. You never run for office. You are put up for office by your friends, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So people who were put up for office, part of what they needed to do, and this was particularly true in the South, was that, but generally true everywhere, you needed to prove to the people who you were running for office among, excuse me, that you were beholden to them. And so around election time, suddenly you would have these people who were put up for office offering a lot of booze, right? Having parties, what is it, treating the people with bumbo, right? Which is a kind of alcoholic punch. You would have a lot of kowtowing of elite people to the masses, essentially parading around the fact, hey, look, see, we're beholden to you and we know it. So vote for me. So it was like a little demonstration of democratic governance. And the reason why it was so important is because that's not going to take place again, right? That's a little exercise before elections. And after that point, things aren't necessarily that way. So on the one hand, they paraded around the fact that they're accountable to the public again and again and again. On the other hand, they masked a lot of the accountability in politics, particularly in the early republic, where they're still defining and fleshing out how America's democratic republic is going to operate. They masked some of the dependency in the system. So in other words, although they wanted to say, yes, public, I am at your disposal, please, shall you give me power? Then I shall use it as you see fit for it to be used. On the other hand, they're saying, but I'm a man, an independent man, beholden to no one. I am a man of honor who knows precisely what I want, and I am running for office, or they would never say that. I've been put up for office because I want to serve the common good. So you masked dependency by doing things like what I mentioned a few moments ago, never saying you're campaigning for office, never saying that you were running for office. You were always put up for office, and you were put up for office by your friends, always friends, not by supporters, not by allies, definitely not by a party, heaven forbid. Your friends are putting you up for office, which is making it sort of all social, based on society and based on ambition at all, right? And masking all of the dependency and all of the ways in which at its core, what this is about is one person wanting power. That's what running for office is. But in the early republic, when they're still figuring out the confines of democracy, they were very careful to put this face on what they were doing to make it all seem sort of safe and friendly, and it's not really about power, and we'll sort of offer you, yes, you have power, and then no, we won't act like the power's out there. This will be quite an image for you to have in your head. They were kind of tap dancing around the realities of what a democratic mode of government meant. And in what that means in one way or another is that accountability was important and accountability was being figured out. Now, Hamilton is a great example of someone who on occasion had a really extreme version, an extreme idea of accountability. And this gets to the idea that I think I mentioned earlier of balance. So there are different ways to be held accountable, right? So Hamilton, referring to the public, he wanted pretty extreme accountability, right? He felt that the public needed to be kept in line, right? He was very quick to gesture towards military suppression of popular unrest, particularly, whiskey rebellions, the various rebellions in this period. As he put it in one letter, I didn't look up the letter, so this is from my index card brain. He said something, I think maybe to James McHenry, whenever the government appears, it must appear as a Hercules, meaning that, the government, whenever it's in public, has to be there in full form, or no one will ever respect it, right? No one will have any respect for this infant government that hasn't done anything. The government always has to come forward strong and has to exert power over the people so they understand the power of government. Now that's a form of accountability. That's on the spectrum of accountability. That's pretty much towards one end, right? We shall use force to hold you accountable to the law. It's a form of accountability. So I'm not saying accountability in every way easily defined and always deployed with an even hand. It isn't necessarily. Which just gets back to my larger point, which is it's a little sloppier than that. And I hadn't thought this through until this morning. I'm going to be, I have been slow in writing recently, but I will be writing about democracy. And I won't go further than that because I'm still figuring it out and I don't want to curse myself. But at any rate, certainly accountability will be in there. And I was planning, of course, since I've been writing odes to accountability for several years at this point, that's going to be part of the conversation. But now, based on my thinking this morning, I am going to be a little bit, it'll be a more interesting discussion, because what I'm going to talk about is the fact that accountability isn't like a scale that's easily measured, that there's variables involved, that there's personal responsibilities involved, that there's some sense of moral responsibility to the larger society. There's a sense of a kind of moral responsibility to institutions of government, or there isn't, but that part of what we look at when we look at accountability has to do with maybe not quite emotions, but connections, personal connections with our system of government, with the demos, right? The American people. The rule of law and accountability absolutely are vital, but the spirit of a society matters as well. You could pretend to be accountable in many, many ways, and it might not matter if the spirit of a society, the spirit that was holding accountability and the rule of law, which is part of how you enforce accountability, in place, was not correct. And in a sense, this is where I get to the part where I'm like, not sure how I'm going to end. Part of our current disease as a society is that the spirit of our society is ailing, to put it nicely. We don't generally have some sense of spirit to the larger we. And I've been talking about we a lot too. I even did it during my presidential address at Scheer, right? I managed to get to a crowd of 200 people. We matters, and we're not really focused on our we. We are at a moment when, ironically, it's almost like the ultimate metaphor for a sick society, an ailing society, is a pandemic swept through the world, swept through the United States, and Americans, some of them, couldn't be bothered to put on masks to protect the larger whole, right? So if you're talking about an ailing society in which somehow or other the spirit of society isn't quite in the right place, the fact that you had an actual ailment pass through the world and pass through the United States, and in the United States particularly, many people just refused to put on a mask, even if it was just for other people. That if 50 years from now, if I were writing about this moment, that would be the metaphor that I would choose. You want to talk about an ailing nation, ailing democracy, ailing accountability? Let's talk about what happened when an actual ailment passed through society and how people responded, which is why Alex Jones being found guilty, and I guess so far he's been charged $4.1 million, I think, but now there's, I think more money is going to be charged for damages. This is not an episode about Alex Jones, but it's why that simple, however much he's charged, and it may not matter a lot because he's made millions off of what he does. The simple fact that he did something so wrong, so repulsive, and was held accountable for it under the rule of law in front of the public matters, right? It's like this little moment where, at least for me, some part of me was like, oh, thank heaven. Look, it's accountability. And it feels so wonderful to see it because it's so rarely seen. Everything is, everyone in one way or another is trying to mask it, ignore it, lie around it. There's so many ways in which accountability is being denied. We don't, at this point, all agree on what accountability means. We don't all agree on what that looks like. And that gets back to the balance that I mentioned a few moments ago. Clamping down on everyone so they do what you want them to do is one version of accountability. So there are different ways of enforcing it. And for some people, there are some people who pretty explicitly don't know if accountability should exist at all, right? The people who, months ago when I said, I don't think people understand what they lose when they lose democracy, the people who responded to that by saying to me, democracy doesn't really work anyway. Like, maybe it's time to try something different. Those are people saying, to heck with accountability, right? Democracy, first of all, those are people who fundamentally don't understand what democracy is and don't understand what they're doing with power by saying that. But those are people who are fundamentally saying, although they don't realize it necessarily, this accountability in government thing, this democratic small d thing, why do we need it at all? So without accountability, you do, and you can see how with that reasoning, you do lose democracy. But where I want to end today is, I've been saying again and again, we need accountability. We need to stand behind it. We need to enforce it. We need to hold the rule of law in place. All of that is correct. But I want to add to that today the fact that we also need to say that the idea of accountability, the implications of accountability, the spirit of accountability, the way in which that embodies our responsibility to each other, even in its most basic form, even allowing for the fact that in all of American history, we've had people who were polarized in one way or another and hating each other, and each, sometimes more than others, saying that the opponent is not American, right? None of that is new. But even with all of that in play, we do need to think about the idea of accountability, the idea of the rule of law, in addition to their enforcement, because the spirit of a society matters. And democracy, in a sense, is a pact between a people that relies at its basic, most fundamental level on the spirit of a people. That's part of what the founders were saying again and again in the founding period. It's part of why when people in France said, hey, we like what you did, maybe we can do something like that here. And people, I think it was Gouverneur Morris, said something along the lines of, it might be John Adams, and I don't want to take credit away from him. So it could be either one of those guys, but whoever said it, what they said was, a government for a nation is like a coat, a jacket for a person. It has to fit precisely. You can't take what happened in America and just put it on top of France. It won't fit. You have to focus on the spirit and heart of a society to figure out the kind of government that will work with it best. That is part of what I'm talking about here, the soft edges of accountability and the ways in which the spirit of a society matter. Now, I didn't want to end on a grim note. And that was when I ran out of time to think about this morning and I began setting things up. I thought, I'm going to be ending in a dire note, which is the spirit of a society matters, the spirit of accountability, our sense of, in some way or another, even if we're angry at each other, even if we hate each other, that there's some kind of fundamental pact or commitment to the spirit of democracy, that's important. And I'm saying, it's ailing right now. We don't really have it. I have no solution to that problem. I truly don't. And I hope folks out there do. What I do want to end with is we need to be aware that accountability, enforcing accountability, feeling that people with power need to be responsible for the way that they use that power, that awareness is the start of, or the base of, a real, almost moral quandary that we have to wrestle with as a nation. Obviously, that's not something that you, well, by March, we'll have wrestled with that and it'll be all better. It's a larger problem. And I don't have a solution, which is why this feels dire. I just want to say, as much as I preach accountability, as much as I offer an ode to accountability, everything around accountability and the exact way that we understand accountability matters enormously. So in a sense, it's even more important. Its existence is even more important than I've expressed so far. And I see, I don't even have chat open, and I see mug, mug, mug. You guys can tell that I'm like moving into the conclusion. Okay, let me, if there's anyone here who is new to what we're doing. So for over 2 years now, every week I find a mug that is related to whatever topic it is we're discussing. Thank you, Carolee. The 122nd week of History Matters. Man, oh man. I don't have 122 mugs. I truly don't. And I'm now at the point where, like this morning, I was like, oh man, like you guys have seen all the mugs. You've seen all the mugs. So I have to ignore that fact now and just find the one that works best. So if we're talking about accountability and the fact that it matters and it isn't here, and I don't know how to fix this, but we need to think about it and wrestle with all the soft edges around it, I think that realization and this mug are linked. History should make you feel uncomfortable. The fact that you can look over time and see the importance of accountability and that it's kind of semi-absent right now is pretty dire. That should make you uncomfortable. I'm sure for many of us, including me, it already does. But, you know, looking back in history at how accountability has and hasn't been put in place and what that has or hasn't done for democracy, that's an important way of understanding American history. Okay.
So Tom apparently is your mug gifter for that particular mug.
I was hoping. I was like, I know someone gave it to me. Tom, thank you. Thank you. I love the fact that, you know, Tom gave me this. I forget every week who gave me this. Beth?
I'm not sure. Carolee might remember. She's better at that stuff.
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. I always tell my students I'm a historian because I'm not good at names or dates, which I truly am not. So anyway, my not remembering names is not a sign of my lack of caring for what you do, because this stuff actually means more than I can say, truly. But anyway, I thank both of you and others who have given mugs. That was has been a real sign for me that like people are listening and it matters. And I appreciate that. Okay, so I'm going to open my chat so I can kind of see what's going along here, and we can open things up. Well, I went a little long to questions.
All right, so the first one, is there any recourse now that we found out that Kavanaugh was not vetted properly, or does Senate confirmation preempt that? Let the buyer beware.
Right. Well, here's a nifty example of the soft edges of accountability, right? So the process as it's supposed to happen does not appear to have happened. You're going to give someone that amount of responsibility. There needs to be pretty extreme checking of that person, vetting of that person before you go ahead with that. The question is, now what, right? So that becomes, and this is also a question that gets back to my balance point. And I don't have the answer to this, but if this is the moment when people are saying, ooh, like this vital step in appointing a Supreme Court justice was not followed, and thus, in a sense, this person is unaccountable for whatever it is that they did that might have kept them from holding office. What do you do? What do you do? Do you, this, you could say the same thing about a Supreme Court justice whose wife was involved in an attempt to overthrow the government, right? How and when do you hold people accountable? You can certainly feel that it's pretty clear that some people should be held accountable, but here you bump up against the kind of moral spirit that I was just talking about, and the system itself, and the fact that those two things have to be in play. And the system offers, and this is going to be the most obvious thing, maybe not that I've ever said, but an obvious thing, any political system, including ours, has endless gaps and spaces to hide things, avoid things, sweep things under rugs. So accountability can appear to be in play when it really isn't, which in a sense is what we're talking about with Kavanaugh. Or we can assume it's in play and haven't ever seen it and it just was ignored. I don't know what that means. It's part of, and it's interesting, I would have mentioned at the beginning if I had thought of it before offering my ode to accountability. It's another example of this, right? Because you put someone up for this, and we're seeing every day the way in which the court is increasingly sort of holding forth on major social issues in a interesting way. If you're going to be given that degree of power, you should be at least held accountable for who you are and what you've done in the past, so that you could be trusted with that degree of power. And apparently, and again, I'm speaking off the top of my head here, so I can't go into any detail, and someone might even say, no, Joanne, you are speaking based on a tweet, which might be true. But whether this is happening or not, what this suggests, this situation, if it is, as I'm saying here, it's a person who is never held accountable for his past, right? And that gets back to, in many ways, accountability, a lack of accountability is the crisis of our time. And I wrote that last night when I was tweeting about this episode, and I paused because I thought, well, actually racism is the problem of our time, the crisis of our time. And then I thought, no, actually racism is bound right up in this, because everyone denies being racist, right? No one's racist. Oh no, not me. I'm not racist. It's you evil people who are calling me a racist, who are bad. So here are people who clearly have a problem with people whose race is different from theirs, denying any accountability for that at all. Right? Doesn't exist. I think, who was it? Was it Orban of Hungary, who said yesterday or the day before, no Christian can be racist? Yeah. I held myself back from responding to that. I truly, but anyway, you can already see, I'm like, yeah. Putting that to the side, I think even our problem with race right now, and racism, let's put it that way, is part of this accountability crisis, because many people do not want to accept accountability for that as a nation. We'll just cut it out all of the history books, or personally to acknowledge the fact that, yeah, it's a pretty fundamental problem, has always been for the United States, and we need to reckon with it. Even that is being denied, right? Nothing there, no accountability there. So it's all connected in one way or another. It's all connected, which took me very far away from your question, I realized, which was Kavanaugh, but I kind of got carried away there.
Nope, all good. Okay, we have a couple of questions from Dave. I might mix them in between others. His first one says he's listened to your lecture on Benedict Arnold. He wondered, in the context of that history, what are your thoughts on a judge in the January 6th trials apparently ruling that former military vets and police officers who were found guilty should get lesser punishments because of their service?
Oh,
yeah. Dave thinks that they should get more because they should be held to a higher standard, but he wanted to know your take on it.
Well, that's interesting. And I did have a brief moment this morning when I thought about the military, because when I was looking around in books and Googling around, one of the interesting things that I saw and decided not to address is the problem of accountability in the military, which is hugely important, right? Because the military is not a democracy, right? The military is like rank officers, you listen to the people who give you orders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you're not being accountable in that environment, that's a pretty serious problem. But as far as a military judge versus a civilian judge, so if you're being court-martialed and you're talking about that, in a sense, that's almost an easier way to hold someone accountable, because military rule and military laws are I don't want to say don't connect to larger laws, but it is its own world. As far as society goes, I don't, in that case, you have to, again, what you're saying is we shall take this to the American legal system and put it in play. Should they get more or should they get less of a punishment? In a sense, what we think on that issue doesn't matter, because it really is the judge and the jury, right? I mean, that's the heart of our system. Is we might think, well, that person, they had power and weapons and should be held more responsible for the things that they do, which we very well might all agree with. But our legal system, again, has accountability and personal judgment on the part of juries and judges in it as well. So innocent until proven guilty is pretty important. But beyond that, we see every day, there's a lot of play. So I don't know if I have a hard coming down on this question.
All right.
I do know that when the Continental Army was first formed and Washington was made commander-in-chief, and he went up to Massachusetts, which is where troops were at that particular moment. It was Massachusetts men, and they apparently elected their officers, right? It wasn't like, oh, I'm your commander. The group got together and elected who was going to lead them. And Washington was like, really? What kind of an army? Like a democratic army? Really? So he wasn't really excited about that whole idea, but that gets to this larger idea.
We're getting all kinds of people in the chat fired up about the military versus general court.
It's a big issue, but it's complicated.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna field you one from Dale, and then we'll go back to Dave's other question. Dale asked, today we seem to have several we's in our country, each we having a different idea of accountability. Were there other times in history in which that was the case, and what could we learn from it?
Well, so in a sense, stated in a basic way, there has never been just one we. There's never been just like, we are Americans. The only time when that comes close to happening is during a real crisis, like right after 9/11, right? There was a moment where all of a sudden everyone came together. If you'd pushed that at that moment, people would have started to flitter apart. But everyone felt like, this is an attack on us, and it felt like a we. So in a sense, on a, I don't want to say surface level, but on the most basic level, there isn't a we. But right now, I think that's true. Plus, I think there's an added bonus problem with that. And that is what I mentioned before, is that we're now talking not just about, I think these rights are important. I think these rights are important. I want society to look this way. I want society to look this way. My rights are being ignored. I don't care about your rights. We're now getting way down to, I don't know if I want democracy anymore. And I might not say it that bluntly, but that's what's being said by some people. That's attacking the idea of a we, right? That's a different level of attacking what society is. No society is like, join together, here we are in harmony and unity. It just doesn't happen. So when I say we, I don't mean some happy, joyous, we're all holding hands and with a flower. But what I do mean is there's an assumption that in the end, there is some kind of broader we than us disagreeing about whatever is going on the most fundamental level. That's just, we are a democratic nation. And because of that, there is a national we. We might disagree about every aspect of it, but we still buy into the idea that there's a national we. That idea right now is being attacked. And again, I have no brilliant solution for this, but it's a pretty extreme state of affairs, because for all of the reasons that I'm saying here, actually, tie accountability to democracy. Democracy also relies on the spirit of a people, on their sense of their connection with the government, on their sense of the government's connection with them, on their sense of commitment to the pact of government that Americans share with each other. All of those things, not cut and dried, pretty central. And so when those things wane on the most fundamental level, I don't know if I need to feel responsible to anything, anyone, the government, any other American I disagree with. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure we need a democracy or democratic governance at all. That's pretty extreme. And it's not that no one has believed that before in American history, but now we have a major party kind of campaigning on it. And that's pretty dire. As a historian, I hate to say, like, first, unique only, and I always tell my students not to do that. But there are people now who are basically saying, I don't really care if there even is a we at all. And that's, pushed to its limit. That can be a transformative moment. And I don't know, I've also said a lot of times here, extreme contingency, someone just got bingo. We are at a moment of extreme contingency. And that means things can go really badly, or things might go well, and we might be able to institute change if we're aware of the fact that we're in this moment and change can happen. But it's only going to happen if we're aware of the extreme contingency of this moment and do everything that we can to come into play and act and work, not take for granted that we've lost, not take for granted that we're done, but realize that just as easily as everything might go south, not to have anything against the South, I love the South, let's put it a different way, not to say that everything is going to move in an authoritarian direction necessarily, right? But that if we can do that, we can at least begin to push things in the other direction too. So whenever I'm asked to speak on these related topics publicly, that's the point I always make, because I don't want people to feel like, well, the contest is done, we lost. Because if you say that, then that's true. And I don't think that's true. But I do think we're at a really dire point, and it's hard. Now I see people saying, sometimes in response, again, to tweets, I've heard people saying this is the most important election of our lives for my entire life, so I'm tired of listening to it. I've heard people saying this is a dire crisis, as long as, which on the one hand I understand, and which until very recently held me from making those kinds of absolute statements. If you were to go back and study the trail of my tweets, you will see initially I'm being really restrained with that kind of language, because I thought if I start at a really early point in discussing our situation as being as dire as I think it is, if I did that too early, people wouldn't hear me when they really needed to hear me. So I have been and continue to very carefully measure, sometimes I slip up, but very carefully measure my tone in addressing this, because I don't want people to think this is over. It isn't over. But I want them to hear what I'm saying, because it isn't over, right? So I understand that we're going down is everywhere, and you can either assume that that's true or ignore it entirely. Somewhere in the middle is where we should be.
Yeah. So the next question from Dave says, it seems like political parties, especially getting convictions on those who are impeached or censored by Congress, is highly unlikely now. So has accountability now been reduced to the Department of Justice indicting and prosecuting politicians rather than going the impeachment route?
I don't know. I do know that I have seen that argued. I can't now remember where I read it, that because of the crimes, the corruption and everything else, because of the things that led to two attempts at impeachment happening, and the fact that it didn't happen, that in some ways that tool has now been defanged, right? That tool, if it doesn't work then, and whatever reason, however it was that it didn't work then, it's now not going to ever work because people can see that they have an exit and they're going to use it in that way. Which may be true. I also have seen argued, and this is true as well, that our system wasn't set up for the judiciary to be the hammer, right? It was set up so that certainly the Supreme Court is judging what's being done by other branches of government, and in that sense has real power, but it was considered in many ways to be the weakest branch of government. So the fact that now it's kind of being seen as, the ultimate, the Department of Justice and the Supreme Court will be declaring, it's an interesting moment in the history of the Supreme Court and in the history of the judiciary. Again, these are things that ebb and flow over time. So as I've said also many times, history doesn't do this, it does this. But this question leads to a bigger question, which I also don't know the answer to, which is, where are we going with our balance between legislatures, executives of various sorts, governors and presidents, political parties, and the judiciary? And it's an interesting moment. All these people looking to the Department of Justice, like, do something. And yet nobody knows for sure. What should you be doing? I know what I think you should be doing. It's a real, it's a difficult moment in a lot of ways, and the judiciary and the judicial aspect of our system is part of it.
Yeah, Laura's asking about the people who we now have been told there's evidence that they intentionally deleted the government text messages off their phones from January 6th. So
right. So talk about avoiding
accountability, or the people who wiped it, or the people who allowed them to be wiped.
But think about the ultimate avoidance of accountability, right? You preserve government documents. That's why we have a National Archives. You preserve government documents. There's, laws surrounding that. Why? Because it preserves the history of what happened, and because it creates the historical record, right? So yeah, all of this erasure, again, oh, well, I might get in trouble. Boop, not accountable. It disappeared. Part of this larger thing I'm talking about. Now, Gloria made a point, and I want to respond to it. Gloria says, a lot of people are concerned about the economy, and they think that this crisis of accountability talk is kind of a cover-up or taking attention away. My response to those kinds of assertions is not that the economy doesn't count, but that if you allow accountability to slip, good luck in trying to influence government in some way that you see fit, right? Let's say for some reason, the government or a majority in Congress decides this week, we hate Nevada because there's someone important in Nevada that doesn't like us. You know what? Nevada, your gas prices are going to be different. You know what I mean? Not that that could really happen, but nothing is going to happen without that basic fact of accountability. So I, on the one hand, can see why people might think that, because inflation and gas prices are immediate and they're in our everyday lives, and accountability feels like this thing that's floating in the air. But in a sense, it's the most fundamental thing of all, because without it, you don't have rights. You won't have a strong say in what happens. You will be ceding your power to people who could basically do whatever the heck they want. And you may think you agree with them now, but in 5 years, you may not, and you won't have a fair and just way to protest against that. So that's my comeback, is not that they don't matter, they do, but you can't protect that or act against it or protest it if you give up your power on this most fundamental level. So that's, I getting all worked up. That's my fundamental response to that.
Well, as Gloria was putting in that chat, she also put in the Q&A a question about how do we distinguish between accountability and a witch hunt? Because a lot of people are using those two phrases as well. I think,
well,
yeah.
Well, but and part of that is the rule of law, right? Like a just rule of law. I mean, a witch hunt is like, you are a witch, and it's based on the fact that Goody Jones saw you talking to a cow. It's like, well, maybe Goody Jones didn't see it. I mean, there were trials, but they were trials. I do think some people tend to use witch hunt for everything that involves the rule of law and accountability, I don't think they're interchangeable. I think a witch hunt is explicitly looking for villains, right? Is a witch hunt is, I must find someone to blame, it's you, you know. Accountability is, you are accountable for your actions, and if you seem to be doing something wrong, you will be taken to court, or you will be, what you have done will be examined, and we can see how you've been using your power. Not the same thing. A witch hunt is targeted. Accountability is, you know, is not in the same way targeted as, you know, we must find enemies and you are the one. It's a different thing. So, you know, I've talked about this before too. Words matter a lot right now. And people are using them in all kinds of ways. So like critical race theory now has no meaning, right? Woke now has no meaning because people use them in every way that they can possibly use them. And I think witch hunt is another one of these things that gets used, and in a way, you know, justice gets sort of stuck in there, and they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
I'm getting another new Joanne.
It's like CRT.
Yeah,
What's,
right. Well,
you know, it's not what it started off in law school, right?
Oh, no, we're almost out of time, and I've gotten myself all worked up.
I know. So we got a couple more questions. I don't know if we have time. One is asking you, how would you compare the retired General Michael Flynn to Benedict Arnold?
Oh, I don't even know how to answer that. Yeah, I don't. Actually, I won't answer that because not that I don't think there's a comparison to be made, but the situations are so different that for me to make a smart comparison there, I would need to think about that more and the context behind them. But it's an interesting question because it's an interesting comparison.
Make a great lesson, Carolee. Write that down. All right. Well, do you want to take, it's 11 o'clock. We have a couple more, or we can segue to after party. It's up to you.
Let's start with another one and see where it takes us.
Okay. This one comes to us from Dale. It says, history is not there for you to like or dislike. It is there for you to learn from it, because then as you are less likely to repeat it, it's not yours to erase or destroy. That's a quote Dale found, and he wanted you to comment on.
Oh, yeah. Well, but indeed,
drop.
That's right. No, but indeed, right? It's no accident that people who want power immediately attempt to grab hold of history and own it, shape it, and erase things. Because if you can claim the past in a way that people will buy, right, in a feasible kind of a way, at least to some people, that's power, right? That's which is why everyone is always pointing to the founder blob, right? Everyone wants to claim the founders. Well, the founders thought, like there's in this Florida patriotic education thing that is not being noticed enough. And one of the things that said there is, you know, the founders didn't really want a separation of church and state. Really, right? But that's being asserted. You could cherry pick a quote or two to prove that. That's wrong. Right? That's wrong. But if you claim that, say it, erase everything around the cherry pick quotes, suddenly you're like, oh, well, you know what? That's never been supposed to be the case in the United States. You can see, you know, in a sense, one of the frightening things about a society and a form of government that has so much play in it, and by that I mean sort of democratic play, is that it's vulnerable, right? Which is part of why some of the founders really didn't want a democracy or any democracy, right? But what are the people going to do? I don't know. It's, you know, which is a part of also how I thought this back around the time of 9/11. These people who took these planes and crashed them into buildings, these were people who came into the United States, learned to fly, and then turned it against the United States. I'm not saying that they should not have been allowed to be here at all. Definitely not saying that, but it shows the fundamental nature of democracy. It has flexibility, and sometimes that can be dangerous, which again is why a belief in the idea of democracy and commitment to the pact that we share with each other ends up being really important in any democratic mode. of government.
Yeah. All right, we've got a couple more if you want to keep going, or
Let's stop only because I'm actually going to be recording my podcast at 1 o'clock. And I definitely want to have the after party. But because I could keep going and would willingly keep going, but I also need to study up for, and actually in the after party, I will mention a story that I found yesterday that I'll be using in the podcast. So it's a sneak preview that I just find really striking, but it'll only be in the after party. Okay, so we're 4 minutes after, so let me say, first of all, as I say every week, thank you for engaging in the conversation of democracy on a Friday morning, as we have for 122 weeks. Unbelievable. It matters a lot, particularly when you're talking about things like we talked about today that are amorphous or hard to define in some way. You have to talk them out to understand them. So these kinds of conversations matter. The fact that we're a community of people having this conversation matters. So I thank you all for coming here. What we are now going to do is go to the after party, which means that we will stop recording and we will have a freer conversation because the recording will have stopped. It will not be a permanent conversation. If you are watching this on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and enter through the NCHE website, which is ncheteach.org/conversations. So leave Facebook, come in through that link, and you will be part of the after party. And in a moment, I saw someone already say poof. Within a moment, poof, the after party will start. If you're here, that's it. If you're here, then someone just got blackout bingo. Man, I'm so predictable. If you're here through NCHE, you will poof be in the after party within moments. But truly, everyone, thank you for coming and continuing to come. I hope everyone, particularly the teachers who are watching, have an easy and smooth coasting of ending of summer. I know some people are starting up in school again. I will be there with you shortly, but not yet. And I will see many of you next week with some new topic that I have no idea what it is. So, and thank you, Annie, as ever. And look at you, like COVID woman, and you're still here.
I have my Kleenex.
Aww.
And I have my tea, so I'm good.
I'm so sorry. Okay. Anyway, I am saving the check. I always do. Okay, so let us segue to the after party, and I hope to see all of you guys next week.